I'm in the kitchen today preparing chicken tortilla soup. I'm Angela. This is Angela's Pantry Obsession. And I am preparing soup for my pantry so that this winter, this fall, even come springtime, I have some soup on my shelf ready to go for lunch or dinner. So this video is going to be very specifically geared for the new canners. When I share with people how I do my canning and home preserving, one of the first things that people share with me that they are interested in learning how to can is soup. And the number one reason that they're interested in that is because they want to lower the sodium that's in the soup that they're eating. I think we've all come to recognize at this point in time that, you know, commercial canned store-bought soups are just jam-packed with sodium, maybe even some other not so friendly ingredients, things that we otherwise really don't want to be consuming. So this will be a little bit of a slower video, step by step. If you are familiar with canning, you know, maybe this will be a good refresher for you. Perhaps just the recipe itself is different and it's something that you'll want to check out. I will have my recipe down in the notes section, so please check that out. And we're gonna get started filling that pantry for the winter. So a couple things before we get started. The first thing that I do is I sanitize all of my countertops. Behind me, I have two canners running. I have a canner that I will be putting my jars in because I'm actually doing two different sizes today. I have a canner that I can double stack my jars, so I'm gonna see how many pint jars I can get. And then I have a canner that I will be dedicating solely just to 7 quarts. So I have my canners with water in there. Your book for your canner, the manual will tell you how much water you need to put in for your canner. Every canner is different on how much it recommends. So I have that set and prepared. I have done the safety checks on my canners as well, which means I have checked through the steam portion over here where the steam will eject during the canning process. I hold it up to the light and I can make sure that I can see the light through it. That means there's nothing obstructing that, and that's very important. I check to make sure that the rubber gasket here, that it's not damaged in any way, melted maybe, who knows. So I just check to make sure that that's in good condition. And then I check to make sure that this can move up and down freely. And then as well as this. If you're nervous about pressure canning, doing a safety check is incredibly important. Well, it's important even if you're not nervous about it, but I can understand that some people would be a little nervous about pressure canning. I'm sure everybody knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, or has just read a story on how maybe a pressure canner exploded. I want you to be completely free at ease, okay? It is much less likely for these current day canners to do that. There are a lot of safety precautions put in place to help avoid that from happening, and this is one of them. If it builds up too much pressure, this will release and all of your pressure will escape and you won't have to worry about that. The next step is making sure that you get all of your jars washed and sanitized. I brought my jars up from the basement, so I'm going to be doing that step next. I'm going to give them all a really good wash in hot water with a little bit of vinegar. I'm going to be checking all of my rims to make sure that there aren't any broken glass, or, you know, making sure it's completely smooth. This way I know at least my jar won't interfere with my sealing at the end of the canning process. So definitely make sure you're checking your jars are still in really good condition. Highly suggest you have all of your ingredients laid out. You have them either chopped and ready and prepared to go, or you have the items that like your spices and any of your dry items and broths and all of that. You have everything out in front of you. One, so you don't forget an ingredient. Ask me how I know that. And two, this way you're not bouncing around feeling flustered. Canning for the first time can feel overwhelming. And one of the very basic ways to ease that frustration and anxiety and feelings of overwhelm is to have everything prepared out in front of you. If you're going off of a recipe, make sure you review that recipe a few times. Go check by check, order by order of the listed ingredients. Read through the process a few times. Familiarize yourself with that recipe so that way as you're going through it, it doesn't feel as overwhelming. I know it's scary for people to begin the canning process, but I promise you this journey can be so enlightening when you go to open that jar for the very first time and enjoy everything that you prepared and put into that jar. But I know getting there can be a little anxiety ridden at times, but I'm here to help, so don't worry. So I have all of my ingredients out for me. I have my jars, as you've seen already. They are in my canner. My jars are in my canner and they will be warmed up here soon. I have a lot of things that I still need to prepare, so I'm not gonna get them warmed up just yet, but they are sanitized. I hand washed them. You can sanitize them in a dishwasher if you like. When my jars are opened and we use whatever's in there, they go through the dishwasher to get clean, sanitized, and then I store them. So when I bring them out of storage, I'm basically just getting the dust off of them. So I give them a really good hand wash in the sink of water, a little bit of vinegar in case there's some cloudiness on my jar, and then I let them sit in my canner while I'm doing everything else. So the first step that I'm going to do now that I have everything laid out is I'm gonna get my chicken going in the oven. When I prepare soup and I have chicken well, I think it's usually just soups. If it's not just the chicken I'm preparing and it's an ingredient in something, I do cook my chicken first. It's kind of like a par-baked item. I don't cook it all the way through. I cook it just so that outside is pretty much cooked, and then I'll bring it out. This way, when the chicken is in my jar, it stays as an individual diced chunk. If you put raw chicken in here, and you absolutely can do that, but if you put raw chicken in here, they're going to clunk together and you're not going to be able to pour out your soup with all your individual pieces. That chicken's going to clunk together and you're going to have to like shred it apart, and it will shred incredibly easily, but most of us prefer a soup that is individualized. So I do cook the chicken first. I'm going to clean the chicken. I will chunk it up in whatever sizes that I think appropriate, and I'll get it in the oven. I have it set at 350. I am not going to put oil or anything on my chicken. I'll put a little bit of salt, just a little, and maybe a little bit of pepper, and I'll let that go, and then when that's in the oven, I'm gonna come and finish prepping the rest of the vegetables that are gonna go into the soup. Okay, so I have my chicken in the sink. I have my cutting board ready to go, and then I have one of the pans that I'll be using to put my chicken in. So this is where I'm gonna remove my rings, because again, I like to be as sanitized as possible. And when I work with meat, I like to take my jewelry off. And I'm going to keep my raw chicken, you know, localized into one area. I have my ingredients off to another side so that I don't get any cross-contamination. Yes, they're gonna be going into the same jar eventually as each other, but again, I want to try and minimize as much as I can any cross-contamination and anything that could get in the way of having a safe canning process. This is just something that I tend just to do no matter what I'm cooking, if I'm just making dinner for the day or canning. So it's a habit that I just am in anyhow. So we're gonna get these diced up and ready to put in the oven. Size chicken that you want. You can go smaller and you can certainly go larger if you like, but it's gonna cook down a little bit. It'll shrink a little bit while it's cooking, both in the oven and then of course in the jar. My family and I prefer to have little pieces of chicken rather than large chunks, but again, that's one of the perks about you making it your way. You get to do your soup the way you prefer it. I do recommend trimming any extra fatty areas or any parts of your chicken that tend to just be less favorable when having to chew on. Go ahead and remove those pieces. If you don't want it during a normal dinner, you're not going to want to put it in your jar. If it's a fattier piece, that could give off a little bit too much grease and fat, and that can actually interfere with the sealing of your jar as well. I trimmed my chicken. I got rid of all of the fatty pieces and any, you know, undesirable pieces of chicken. And I'm just going to sprinkle with a little bit of salt and a little bit of pepper. Now I have a lot of chicken going on here because I am canning, I'm hoping anyhow, that I will get 18 pints and 7 quarts. And I do both sizes because the quarts I will use for a dinner sometime. And then the pints can just be individual dinners or lunches. I also am doing a canning project tomorrow, so I'm just getting ahead of the game. If I'm in here getting my hands dirty with slicing up chicken, I will do it for both canning sessions if I'm able. So I'm gonna get these into the oven, 350 for probably about 20 minutes, 20 to 25. Halfway through, I will take a peek, maybe mix it around a little bit, see how it's going, and then I can always add more time if need be. The goal is not to get these cooked all the way through. The canning process will take care of that. What we're trying to do is just get the outside cooked so that way they don't want to clunk together during the canning process. While the chicken is in the oven, I went ahead and turned on the burners so that both of my canners can start to come up to temperature. I want hot jars because whatever broth I'm going to be using with all of the vegetables and everything that's going into my jar is going to be hot. Hot canner, hot jars, hot food. If I'm cold packing, that means I can have cold jars, cold canner, and cold food. But because I want to bring my food up to temperature, I'm going to be tasting it. I just want to make sure that it's good before I put it in a jar and seal it. So I have everything out in front of me, and while I'm chopping, we're going to talk a little bit to my new canners or those who are considering canning. We're just going to go over a couple procedural things and maybe some information that would be good to know before you get started. I am processing both pints and quarts today. I have all of my pints in one canner and my quarts will be in a different canner. Pints and quarts have to process for a different amount of time. As I get everything diced up, I'm just gonna drop it right into my big pot. I have about 3 onions in there, and they're pretty big, so I'm gonna start with that. I have my peppers already diced up. I was doing a lot of preserving yesterday, getting things just prepared that had come out of my garden, so I went ahead and just diced them up since I was already getting other veggies prepared. So I'm gonna throw those into the pot. I think one of the best tips you can have is if you only have time to can after work, I would say go ahead and utilize the weekend to get all of your ingredients chopped and prepped. This way when you come in from work, you can pretty much just gather everything and throw them into a jar. I should have done that myself. That's probably about 3 to 4 cups of peppers. Now I do have them cut a pretty decent size because through the canning process they will soften up a bit. And if they're really small, you may not know that they were in there. I'm going to do some jalapenos. These have already been washed. I'm gonna leave the seeds and everything in, probably 3 of them. This is a very big batch, so I'm not too concerned about it being spicy if I just leave 3 of them intact. This is where if spice of any level bothers you, you can just leave them out. If you like spicy things but you can't handle a whole lot of heat, then you put in as many as you think you can tolerate. I just de-seeded one of them. We'll taste it and see if we need to adjust it. we have all of our veg in the pot, and now we're going to start adding our liquid. I'm a big proponent to using what you have on hand, and so I do have 2 things of boxed chicken stock. So I'm gonna get that thrown in there to get them out of my pantry. I can my own stock, so I have a feeling this must have been like a large dinner purchase probably. So we'll get this all thrown in here. Wash my jar and throw my lid away. I'm going to add a 26-ounce fire roasted diced green chilies. I'm going to throw that can in there. I'm a big proponent of just using what you have on hand, and so I just gathered up stuff that I had in my pantry. Now, my tomatoes in my garden are not ready for canning batches like this. I have all of my baby tomatoes coming off and the tiny little pear tomatoes, but my large canning tomatoes, I only have a small bag in the freezer so far of them. They're not ready for me to do any canning with just yet. So I'm going to use canned tomatoes. Diced tomatoes, and crushed tomatoes. I'm going to add some water, 6 to 8 cups. Now I'm gonna go in with my seasonings. I've got some chili powder. We'll start with 1 tablespoon. We have onion powder. I'm gonna let the Holy Spirit lead me on this one. That looks good. Garlic powder. Cumin. I'm gonna do quite a bit of cumin. I have cayenne if I think I need it, but given the amount of jalapenos I have in there, I might hold off on it. I love using this in all of my soups. I'll use the beef kind if it's a beef-based soup. It just really adds some really good flavor. You can omit this if you're not comfortable with putting this in your jar. And the reason I say that is because this does have cornstarch, but the little bit that I'm using, I'm comfortable with considering the amount it's going to be making. We're going to use some Mexican oregano. I'll do about that much. And I'm going to kind of just smush it up in my hand to really get it good and fragrant. I'll do some pepper. I would say be careful with the pepper. It does get stronger in the canning process. And then salt, just to help bring out the flavors. You don't need a whole lot of salt. Salt does nothing for you when you are canning. Now this is a lot of soup, so of course a good generous amount to start. you can always add the salt in your bowl when you go to eat it. Salt is just for flavor when we're canning. It is not a preservation tool at all. It does nothing to preserve your food during canning. So the amount of salt that is in the food that comes off of the grocery store shelves is, in my opinion, so they can skip on other flavors while making you think it's flavorful. It's just not necessary. This is gonna go on the stovetop to come to a boil. My chicken is done. I just turned the oven off. It can stay warm while we're waiting on our broth and vegetables to boil. We want those to be hot. We're not really looking to cook anything necessarily, but we do want it to come to a boil so that way everything is nice and hot. The jars are hot, the chicken is hot, and our broth is hot. So we're gonna get that to a boil, and then we'll come back when we're ready to assemble everything. I'm gonna get my kitchen cleaned up, sanitized again, and get everything set up for the actual canning process. So I apologize you can't see me, but I really want to make sure that you can see the setup as I am filling the jars. So for canning, there are a few things you want to make sure you have before you get started. You're going to need your rings to go around your jars that hold the lid on. Now over time, your rings will start to look quite used. I have some that probably look even worse than that. They still work just fine after so long. I mean, some do start to break down a little bit and you can tell they don't twist on quite well, but you use these over and over and over and over again. You have your lids waiting for you. You don't have to simmer and have them in water. The lids these days, that is no longer recommended. You do not have to simmer them. There is a seal at the bottom, and what you used to have to do is simmer them just to get it softened up to help the process for them to seal better. They've made them quite differently now, and you don't no longer have to do that. I always keep mine in somewhat hot water because I'm washing my lids anyhow. So if you choose to not soak them, that's okay. Just make sure you wash them first because again, everything needs to be clean and sanitized. And then I have a magnetic wand. This is optional, especially if you're not going to be simmering your lids. I have a debubbler. Now this one you can purchase specifically for canning, and it does oftentimes come in a kit with other items. This one's nice when you're just getting started because it has a tool here at the one end that allows you to check your headspace. When you're new at canning, you may not know what an inch of headspace looks like. You may not know what a half of an inch headspace. And so you really want to make sure you're getting the correct headspace. It's important for the timing, the process of canning. The recipes have been tested based off of the amount of headspace that's on top. And you also, if you are canning, say, jam, oftentimes jam is 1/4 of an inch. You want to get every bit that you possibly can in one jar. And so if you're constantly canning at a 1/2 of an inch or 3/4 of an inch because you're eyeballing wrong, that's missed opportunity to fill your jar. So after so long, you can definitely learn to eyeball it more properly, but it's a nice tool to have. And then of course the other end is the debubbler that you'll see me do a lot. Even though it's soup, I still go in and debubble. It's a good habit to get into. I think the only thing I do not ever debubble is probably stock and juice. So everything else I make it a habit to debubble. I keep a clean, this happens to be a measuring glass, but you can just use another canning jar. I keep this on the side so that way when I'm canning, I have a sanitary place to put my funnel and my debubbler in, instead of putting it on my counter or my towel here, which is clean, but this way I know it's contained and it helps to contain the mess a little bit. And of course you need a funnel. You need a jar lifter to get the jars in and out, both before you can and when the canning process is over. You need a rag or some paper towels. I have reusable paper towels that I like using because it's really soft, and I could really go through quite a bit when I'm canning because I can be messy at times. So I try to use the reusable kind a few times. And then I have a little dish of vinegar. Vinegar is important in the canning process, especially when you have meat involved, because meat can have a lot of oil. And as you will see, we're going to be wiping the rims of our jars, and the vinegar helps to cut that oil and any grease that might be on there, giving you a better seal on your jar. So with soup, the rule of thumb is you want to keep all of your contents, all of your ingredients about halfway, and then the remaining should be broth. So let's see what we can do. I'm going to add black beans to my jar. They have not been cooked. They will cook in the canning process, and I'm doing just a real little bit. Just enough to fill kind of the very bottom. I'm going to add a little bit of chicken. Funnel, add in some of the veg, and the remaining amount will be broth. We're going to debubble. Clean the rim of the jar very good. Put a lid and a ring on. Now you're gonna see when you start canning that every single recipe will tell you to then put your lid and your ring on fingertip tight. So while you're getting used to what that means, the way I learned was put your lid on, set your ring down, and then with one finger, hold the jar, spin the ring, make sure it's on there properly, and once you cannot twist it anymore, or even the jar will begin to spin, that is fingertip tight. You do not want to crank down on your jar. The canning process is emitting oxygen out of the canner. And so if this is cranked down, it cannot escape out of your jar. So you actually do want to allow space for things to move, I guess is the best way I can describe it. When your jars are done processing, the pressure will come down. You take that jar out of the canner. That's when your seal will happen. Otherwise, you want to be able to have oxygen escape from your jar. So I'm going to set this into the canner. Let's do one more together. Once you have all of your jars in the canner, remember you have your water in there based off of the manual that your canner suggested. I have all of my jars in here, fingertip tight for the lids. The vinegar that you have left over, you can put that in your canner in the water portion. You can just pour it right in there. That will help to eliminate your jars from getting cloudy. I personally skip that step because what happens is that vinegar will start to rust. Maybe not necessarily rust, but it will break down the rings. And for me, that's a tool that I'm using, and I want to be able to use that for as long as possible. I can clean a cloudy jar. That doesn't bother me. If you have very hard water, that might be something that you need to consider. So cloudy jars don't bother me. Extending the life of the ring so I'm not having to go replace them as often is more important to me. But you decide once you go through your canner, when you're taking those jars out after the first couple processes, you might decide your jars are way too cloudy, and it's more time cleaning the jar than it would be just to replace the ring. So that's just a suggestion there. When pressure canning, we do lock down our lids. You want your canner to come up as slow as possible to temperature. So I turn my canner up to about the number 5 on my stove. If you bring everything up to temperature really quickly, you are likely going to experience siphoning. Siphoning is when the product in your jar starts to spew out of your jar. And remember, that falls back to how we have not cranked down the lids of our jars. So what's in your jar still has an opportunity to escape. If you keep an environment that is not going to shock your jars, you should not have that problem. Even experienced canners will experience siphoning from time to time. It isn't necessarily something that is completely avoidable, but you can definitely take precautions to make it less of an issue in most of your canning. Tomato products tend to siphon more than any other food, and we don't really know the reason behind that. So these I'm going to bring up to temperature. I will come back to show you when we start a 10-minute clock. That's when out of this pipcock here, a steam will be coming out of here really fast and fierce. That's when we're going to start the 10-minute process. That is for 10 minutes working to eliminate all of the oxygen out of this canner. That is important to not skip that step. That will affect the whole entire canning process. So that can take some time. So while that's happening, you can go and clean up. Don't leave the kitchen. You have to babysit this for a little bit. So I'll come back to show you what that looks like when we start the 10-minute process. Okay, it can be a little difficult to see. I'm trying to see if I put you can kind of see how it's steaming out of there. You can also really hear it. Now, this over here is going to pop up when there's enough pressure in your canner. If this pops up before you're ready to start your timer or during the 10-minute timer, that's okay. Nothing's happening, pressure's not built up in your canner just yet because you've not blocked this part. So this is coming out of here pretty good. It's not like a puff of steam or anything anymore. It's a constant stream. So I'm going to set my timer for 10 minutes. I will do the same for my other canner. This is a much larger canner though, so it takes a little bit longer than this one does. So I'm gonna set a 10-minute timer and I'll come back when we go on to the next step. Okay, my 10-minute timer went off and I'm going to put my gauge over the top of the petcock. This is a 15-pound weighted gauge. You need to check the elevation that you are in. That will determine whether or not you use the 5, 10, or 15-pound gauge. This is the canner I have my quart jars in, and they will process for 90 minutes. I do not begin that 90-minute process until enough pressure has built up in this canner that it makes my gauge start to rock. That's when I begin my that's when I begin my 90-minute timer. I'll bring you back so you can see what that looks like. My weighted jiggler is now starting to move. That means this has built up enough pressure that it is creating my jiggler to shake like that. This is where you can turn your canner down. You do not need to have it up very high. What that's going to do is it's high heat, high temperature is going to, you might risk scalding the food a little bit. It doesn't need to be a super forceful jiggle. It just needs to have a little bit of a shake, and every couple of seconds it should shake again. So I'm going to turn my canner down. You start to eventually learn your stove on where that sweet spot is. I'm going to turn mine down to a 3, and we'll make sure that it stays moving. If this stops moving, and every so many seconds it doesn't move again, it stops. That means you've lost pressure and you have to restart your time all over again. You really don't want to walk away from your canners. You want to stay within the area, if not even just in your kitchen. I'm cleaning up all of the mess that was made, and so that's a good opportunity to be within earshot of your canner. And I forgot to mention that the moment it started rocking and I realized it was continuing to rock, that's when we start our timer. So I went ahead and set my timer for 90 minutes. I want to take this opportunity to share with you that the USDA Complete Guide to Home Canning is available to you for free. If you just go to their website, this complete manual is free if you download it as an electronic format. It is free. If you want it printed off, that will cost money. I'm a little old school, and so I like to be able to reference things printed out. I opted to print it out, but you do not have to. This is technically the only thing you need to learn how to safely can. It has water bath canning and it has pressure canning. You need to figure out what your elevation is. That is step number 1, because when you're water bath canning, you need to know your elevation, and when you pressure can, you need to know your elevation. It's the same, you know, it's not a different formula for water bath to pressure canning, but how you process during both types matters. So learn what that is so you know which gauge to use. 5 pounds, 10 pounds, or 15 pounds. This is a very good reference, if not the only reference you need. I will say though, as I mentioned before, I think I mentioned, you don't get a whole lot of recipes in here like you do a ball canning book, or there are some other canning books out there. So this is probably your first good choice, if not the only one that you need to reference. So I do recommend. It's also important to look up when it was last revised. And I actually think I probably should do that, because this copy that I have was revised in 2015. No matter what I'm canning, no matter how many times I can, I always go back and reference to make sure I know my headspace and I know the proper amount of time it needs to process for. Like we discussed earlier with the soup, I am processing those jars for the ingredient in my jar that takes the longest processing time. I don't feel comfortable with this recipe processing for the soup time. I have too much in my jars to feel comfortable with that. So that's where you need to do some research yourself, learn a little bit as to why a soup base is processed for such amount of time versus something else. It will help you safely can. If nothing else, just follow what's in this book to the T and you'll be set up for success. I guarantee it. You don't need to worry about whether or not something is safe if you have this guide with you. Okay, so the canners both had their timers go off. So I came in and I just shut the stove off. I am not doing anything else to these canners for probably a good 30 to 40 minutes. The weights, the jigglers on top, have stopped jiggling because I turned the heat off. It's going to come down to an appropriate temperature. Once the pressure is completely out of that canner, we can then open the canner. These gauges here that pop up to tell us that it's now under pressure, that's going to release and it'll pop down and you'll hear it. It'll make a distinguished sound that you'll come to learn. Once that happens, we're going to take the lid off, but I crack the lid ever so much to allow the steam to come out, and I let it sit for 5 minutes to acclimate. Especially right now with it being summer, we have the inside temperature quite cool. If I take that lid off right away and start removing jars, there's going to be such an influx in temperature change. My jars are going to siphon. So I want my jars to slowly acclimate to the temperature that I have in my house compared to what it is in that jar, or rather in the canner. So when it's time, the pressures come down, we'll come back and we'll take these out of the canner and we'll cross our fingers that we get all of them to seal. So you went through all of that work. You diced, you chopped, you pre-cooked your chicken, you threw everything into your jar, you processed it, you canned it. Now what do? When you pull your jars out of the canner, you will, as I had said before, you're going to put them on some sort of a not napkin or paper towel. Oh my gosh. You're going to put them on a towel or some sort of a mat. You want a barrier between your hot jar and your cold counter. And then you're just going to walk away. You're going to go to bed. You're going to go do whatever task you need to do. Depending on the time of day that you're canning will depend on, of course, when you're going to take care of your jars. I typically just wait until the following day. So if it's midday, you will know before you go to bed if you have any jars that have not sealed. You can get those into the fridge. But typically the rule is you can wait 24 hours before having to refrigerate, because by the time this jar comes down to temperature and gets to a point to where now it's been sitting at room temperature, they say 24 hours is the safe time. So I pulled these out of the jar very late last night. And so when I came down this morning, I just washed all of my jars. I washed the rings, as you saw, and now I get to dry them off. I'm going to label what it is. You're going to think you can just look at it and know what it is, and that might be true for some things. My corn, my green beans, you know, potatoes, certain things you can visually see what it is, and there is absolutely no qualms about what is in that jar. So then I just put the year that I canned it. Soups and things that you've got multiple stuff going on, you're gonna wanna document what it is, because I'm gonna do a couple soups that will probably look awfully similar to this. And you know, instead of trying to like stare and analyze what it could be, just write it down on the jar. You could put the exact date. I rotate through things so often, and I just don't have a need to know down to the month and day that I canned something, but I do put the year in case things do overlap from year to year. I will know which to eat first before opening up a newer batch. I ended up with 17 pints, I believe. 18 pints. Oh, somehow I started out with 19. Okay, well, I have 18 pints, and I ended up with only 4 quarts to put on my pantry shelf. I'm still quite proud of that. So this here, I will come up close to show you the difference between your button tops, and there are some differences that you can look to make sure that it is in fact sealed properly. So this jar has the button top on it, and I want you to hear how it makes like that pinging sound. It's also flat. I can't push the button top. And then when you're testing your seals, you should be able to pick it up by the lid, and it should not come off. That sucker is sealed on there, and you need to have something to pry it open. So this is going to sit on my shelf, and it's so pretty, and I can't wait to actually have one for dinner tonight because it smells so good. And I tasted of the broth yesterday when I was fixing it, and it is so good. Now this is a jar that did not seal. So we obviously have the button top that you can not only hear, but you can visually see the difference between the two. So as you're looking at your jars, you'll be able to see that one is in fact sealed and one is not. Now there is occasions where this button top might be pushed down, but you actually do not have a good seal. And for whatever reason, the steam or the heat or something just made that button top come down, but your seal did not actually make a good intact seal. So it'll sound much like that. It sounds more hollow, where a good seal has a ping. So those are different methods to make sure that before you're putting your jars on your shelf, that they are in fact have a good seal. I know I threw a lot at you during this video. Again, we took it slow, we took it step by step. There are some who have zero idea on how to can. They wouldn't know the first step to the middle step to the last step. There are others who know enough that they're familiar with the entire process, just have never done it themselves. This, I hope, speaks to both of those types, because once you do something, and that's anything, once you do it enough, it becomes very natural. It's, you know, like muscle memory. You just know you have to go through the steps. It might seem like a lot in the beginning, and although I will say, yes, it is a little bit of work, but it's something that you can feel good of at the end of the day. And it just feels so good to know that I got to control every single thing I put into this jar. And if there's something my family doesn't like, I can omit it. So I hope this encourages you to watch a little bit more videos, use myself and others to help you do the research to encourage you that we've been doing this for years and years and years. And if everyone can do it, so can you. Take baby steps, choose one small thing to can, get familiar with it, and then just grow from there. So I hope to see you the next time I'm in my kitchen preparing my pantry, or I'm in my pantry to feed my family. I'll see you next time. Thank you.